All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome. Glad you're here. It's a lovely Thursday just before Memorial Day as we get ready for a well-deserved break. We wanted to take just a break in our normal everyday lives and talk about something really important, which is the ultimate gradebook. My name is Jim McVety. I'm the moderator for today's panel, and I'm joined by two exceptional educators. Justin Hall, who comes from Rancho, Cucamonga. Hopefully, I say that right.
You got it right.
And he will be giving us some insights into his experiences as an educator, someone who knows math, science, technology, basically is just this side of working for NASA, as far as I'm concerned. We're also joined by Amy Carmichael. Amy's a vice president at Jupiter. She comes from the classroom and then has been working in a leadership capacity at Jupiter for well over a decade. So, having interacted and served hundreds of schools, if not thousands at this point, Amy brings a panoramic view of what's really necessary for schools. So, we're glad you're here. This is a fabulous audience comprised of small but very mighty school districts from throughout the region. So, we're going to dive right in and talk about how we get an A for understanding what teachers really want in their learning platforms. Justin, Amy, welcome. We're glad you're here.
Glad to be here.
Thank you.
All right.
Glad to be here.
If you have a question, if you're not familiar with Zoom, we'll do a little housekeeping. At this point, we are probably all zoomed out just a little bit, but you know that there is a chat function. We have a couple of folks in the background, and they're ready to serve you with whatever you need. So let's start with a quick poll. Right now, we have a small audience, but as is in keeping with the association, a small but very mighty audience. Carla and Donnie, let's start with you. I'd love to know what you do. If you don't mind, Carla, you're on camera, so let us know where you're from and what do you do?
I am an educational services director for the Siskiyou County Office of Education, which means that I provide support for teachers, paraeducators, administrators to our schools here in Siskiyou County. And my content focus, I guess, would be history, social studies, English language arts, and social emotional learning. So
oh, is that all?
yeah, in small counties and small county offices, we wear a lot of hats. So the great thing is about that is that I'm always learning something new. But it does get it sometimes I get my wires crossed and I, am talking history, social studies when I should be talking SEL. So it's a lot of hats to wear.
It's a lot of hats, and that is, I think, an important reality that not enough people understand, which is that as a function of being in a small district, one might assume the issues are not complex, but they are. They're so complex, and I think by comparison to your big district peers, I think people undervalue the complexity and the nuance that's required to be successful, in part because you wear so many hats.
Mm-hmm.
Donnie, we're glad you're here. I see you've taken yourself off the mute. So if you like, we'd love for you to tell us where you're from and what you do.
I'm also from Siskiyou County, and I teach special day class, ages 3 to 21 in Doris, California.
Right on. Awesome. Well, and so ages 3 to 21, you said, and for a special day class.
Right.
So if there was a queue to get into heaven, special teachers go right to the front of the line. You have my undying support, and we're grateful to you for all the work that you do, and I mean that. So we're glad you're both here. We're glad the rest of the community will be enjoying this as they join in today. And as we record this for posterity, it will be distributed out to the entire association for future viewing. So we're very glad you're here. And let's talk about precisely who you're here with. Justin, I mentioned, is a math and science teacher at Rancho Cucamonga High School. Here's a little bit about him. He's been teaching for 16 years. And despite all the frustrations, he loves technology. If you can imagine what his year must have been like, he's the kind of guy who can pull apart a computer and put it back together again. So we're really glad you're here, Justin. Thanks for being here. Amy Carmichael, as I mentioned, is the Vice President of Sales at Jupiter, but really she kind of runs the show over there. That's the thing I've learned. She's a veteran educator and has been with the company for more than a decade. So having seen the good, the bad, and the ugly around systems in education, Amy has really stuck it out with Jupiter because they understand much of what's required in the small district setup. And I'm just here as your host. They chose me for this just because they needed the best looking host who was available at 3 o'clock on a Thursday before Memorial Day. There aren't a lot of us, so you're stuck with me. But I run a small advisory firm. We work with Jupiter. We get to know folks like Justin, and we're better off for it. So, Justin, I've occupied a lot of airtime here. Tell us a little bit about your school. Not only does it have a rockin' name, but what do you do over there? Tell us about your school and your setup.
We are a middle school, which in California terms, that usually means 6th, 7th, and 8th. So that's what we do. We are a public school. We are one of several middle schools in our city. Where I live, we have you'll get a city. You will often have multiple school districts that operate in the same city, so it's not as if there's one citywide school district. Like everyone else in public education and actually private education, we were trying to get through this year. We put on remote learning, and we did everything in our power to make as much of an impact and have as positive a year as possible, given the circumstances, which is really tough. But but we came through. My year just finished last week, so we're actually all done now.
So you're all done, and yet you're rocking the tie. Kudos to you. That's impressive. I barely put on a shirt this morning, so I'm impressed. But that is a typical educator, always ready to roll. Now, you mentioned a couple of things about your year and what it's been like. Amy, I'm going to turn to you because the work that you've been doing with schools across the country, certainly in California, districts big and small, but talk about what you're hearing in schools, what the transition looked like. Now, this question is, what it looked like at your school, but Amy, you've been working with a lot of schools. Talk about what it was like beginning of year as you started to work, see them grapple with all these issues.
Yeah, I mean, for us at Jupiter, we sort of felt like that we've been preparing for a pandemic for 10 years, right? And we started with having these, online learning platform a long time ago, and we were struggling getting teachers to use it because, they get comfortable in the classroom, they're using it for what they needed it for. And we get some people who would adopt it, but as soon as everybody had to go home from school, suddenly they were using those products or using those features of the product that they already had. And, we got a lot of great feedback right away. I was super excited to see the teachers use our remote attendance and use, the parent forms and, the online forms and all that stuff. So it was a quick, fast change, but I was really impressed by how schools adapted right away. I mean, it felt like it only took 2 weeks and suddenly everybody was up and running again.
Yeah, it was pretty amazing actually to see. They floated a post out to social media, and it's one of the, I don't have a big following, but I just put a post out that said the things that teachers have done this year are simply magical. And it was amazing how every non-educator who saw that just put a heart right next to it, because it was pretty amazing to watch how that happened. I want to acknowledge a couple of folks that have joined along. Ryan and Nicole, we're very glad you're here. Welcome, welcome. This is an open forum, so we're just here to share our experiences. Of course, we want to tell the story of Justin and his work, and Amy and the impact that she's having in schools. But feel free to share out if you want to talk about the impact. I'm particularly interested in the impact on the classroom. So if we have teachers in the room and you're willing to share out, I'd love for you to talk about, the difference between September and May. I would be pretty profound. What did you go through? If anyone wants to share out. All right. Well, I won't go the teacher route and cold call, but if you're all welcome, I see some folks maybe signaling they want to share. I'm not sure. No worries. Okay. So the thing that I saw between September and May was what engagement was really going to look like. So, and attendance is actually kind of an example of that. So attendance for a lot of classrooms that I observed, including my own kids sitting outside my office, was a slog. It was like just ticking through, and 15 minutes in, you've already lost half of them. I see some heads nodding, so you know what I'm after. Because it's really hard to capture a kid and have them maintain their posture. So I think that's pretty important to acknowledge. But I'm willing to bet that as hard as it is come May, that posture is better than it ever was. People get what it's like to be in a virtual setting or in a hybrid setting. So anyway, just some setting of context there. And before we head into some of the more functional areas of this conversation, I want to take a minute and acknowledge more about the myths associated with small school districts. Justin, I'm turning to you because you're historically under-resourced. What do people, talk about some of the myths that you've had to debunk around small school districts? And again, I invite anyone to share out if they'd like to join in.
It's a little tricky because there are so many different school districts in so many different parts of the country that function in so many different ways. You have a lot of variables at play, so it's really hard to nail down one. Um,
Well, one of the ones that we talked about was the many hats issue that came up. And how many hats are you wearing right now? Oh, did Justin freeze up? Looks like he did. Okay, no worries. So, Justin, if we can get you
no,
to, there we
I
go.
wear. Yeah, it's getting unstable for some reason.
Okay, there we go. You're back now.
All right, am I back or
You're
did I leave
back. You're
again?
perfect. You're perfect. Yep. Thank you.
Okay.
All
All
right.
right.
So we were
Did you get
talking
my answer,
about.
or did it totally get?
No, we didn't hear the answer. That was your dry run. That was your practice. So talk about
Okay,
the many
so
hats.
the answer, there it is. Okay, so I have two main hats that I wear at work. One is I'm a teacher. I teach math and science. I'm also the leadership teacher. But then I'm the Jupyter admin. I'm the one that is responsible for managing our online gradebook as well. So anything from inputting students to switching students around classes, all that kind of thing, I monitor in the background, keep the student database nice and clean.
Yep, yep. That to me speaks to the biggest myth about small school districts. It's not that you don't have the needs, it's that you don't have the people to serve all those needs. So here we have an educator who's also an administrator of an enterprise level platform. And I think that's really important as we look at, as we look ahead to the kinds of systems that you're going to need to be successful, they have to acknowledge that the folks using those systems, that's not their exclusive job. There is not a single person who's only focused on one thing. There are many people, each of whom are focused on many things. But today, we're talking about the ultimate gradebook. That's what we're after. Whether it's Jupyter or another platform, really what we're after is what's the methodology? What are the factors to consider as you think about evaluating a gradebook? Justin, you've been at this for a while. You've looked at a few. I wonder if you could, react to some of these bullet points, because the research that we've done, independent of our platform, is serving up a couple of things here. Customization and the ability to go back and forth between standards-based grading is huge, as is easy reporting and engagement, and of course integrating it all together. But in your own words, talk about the things that matter to you, Justin, because I think that would be most helpful for our audience.
I mean, I'm a classroom teacher, right? So I have a number of needs from technology. One of my primary needs is I need a gradebook that works well as a gradebook. There are a lot of products that function as gradebooks, or they have a gradebook component, but they're not gradebooks at their core, and so they always kind of lack a little bit. One of the products in our area that became popular a few years ago is School Loop. my district isn't using it as a gradebook, but I know some of our neighboring districts have. And while it's a very good communication platform, that I have a lot of respect for, it's not really a gradebook in that it gives you all the tools you need as a teacher. And what I discovered is, as a gradebook, I really like the ability to have seating charts as part of the gradebook, which is something that's nice. And I like flexibility among those seating charts because, as we all know, if you've ever been in the classroom, no two classrooms look alike. There's always a teacher's desk in the front, back. There's that weird table in the corner for some reason that you have and you can't get rid of. There's all these things that you have to deal with or take into consideration, for something as simple as a seating chart. Another thing that I look at that's important to me is that customization option. I really need the ability to weight grades according to whatever my school plan is. And if I have any leeway, it's nice to be able to do that. And just not all gradebooks do that. It seems like a basic feature, at least for me at this point. But as I've looked at some other platforms, I didn't always see that. And that's something, if I'm just trying to whittle it down to the most important things, I'd say those two are actually pretty high up there, surprisingly. You might not think so, but they're pretty high up there at this point. And I appreciate being able to do those things in a way that's pretty easy as well, because having the function, having a feature is not the same thing as being able to use it easily.
Amy, as you look at, that's actually a really good point. Actually, that's really good. I like that, Justin. Simply having a function, checking a box doesn't mean it actually works. And we see that actually. So in my work as an independent researcher, as a facilitator of groups and panel discussions, I often see the check boxes, are complete. Doesn't mean they actually work. Amy, I'd look to you. Talk about the origin story for some of the things that Justin's talking about, those things that work for him in his classroom. They maybe they weren't always there. Maybe they came up organically. Can you talk a little bit about how they derived?
Yeah, the founder of Jupiter is an 8th grade teacher, and he was, tired of doing his grades on an Excel spreadsheet. And the school district that he worked for in California had bought an online gradebook. I can't remember which one it was, but this is back in 2003 when there weren't a lot of online gradebooks, or excuse me, there were no online gradebooks, but there were no electronic gradebooks, and the ones that did exist were really clunky. And he wanted to have a way to access his grades from home. So he was just thinking for himself, what can I do to make my life as a teacher easier? And then he, it became such a big project. He ended up selling it to fellow teachers and then other schools. But, he had to weight grades. So he was putting that in there. He had, was being asked about standards-based grading. So he built that in there as a feature. And as a company, most of the employees are former teachers. And part of that is that we're always trying to think about how can we make less work for the teacher? How can we cut down on the number of clicks? How do we make this take work off of the teacher's plate, not put work on the teacher's plate? So like Justin was talking about, being able to use these things and have them work really easily, like the standards-based grading. There are some big grade books out there that they have standards-based grading, but it was kind of like an add-on at a different time. And so it's very clunky. It's like a workaround that they try to put on there, and it makes it hard to use. With Jupiter, we're always trying to make it as streamlined as possible because we've been there. We've been teachers, and I don't want to make this harder on the teacher. I want to make it as easy as possible. So for us, it's always been valuing that teacher's time and how can we make this work the way that they already work and not make them have to change the way that they do their grading to use our product.
I think one thing that occurs to me that Justin and the founder of your company, Amy, David, is that you have to be a little selfish in this process. So we're here today talking about how to evaluate and potentially even select a gradebook, and we offer Jupiter up as a model for sure. We like to think that the company has done right by the schools it's worked with, but I'm observing, and I hadn't thought of this till just now, that for these things to be successful, that you have to be a little selfish. So Justin has got to figure out, what does he really need? And it really comes down to two things that he really needs. And it might be, and again, I invite you to drop in the chat or just raise your hand if you want to share, like, what do you really need? And I think David maybe was a little selfish there. He said, look, I need something that I can actually use, has standards-based grading. And by being selfish about your time and about your capacity, that seems to be where you get. So it's interesting because you mentioned how many clicks are involved. Justin, have you gone through a process like figuring out different systems? All right, this one has, 1 billion clicks, and this one has less than 1 billion. Feels like that could be a measure.
When I was looking, when I found Jupyter and eventually converted to it and got my other teachers to buy in, and then now my admin level for school wide, I really didn't think in terms of how many clicks. That's actually something that I looked at. I mean, if I'm being honest, I looked at it more of as a marketing strategy from Jupyter. But as I thought about it more, I'm like, well, they are right though. It is faster to take 2 clicks versus 3 clicks to get here, and so I'm not sure if it's strictly a number of clicks, but it's how your data is managed for the format that you have. You only have a finite number of amount of space in front of you on your typical computer monitor. So, the question then is, how do you get the maximum amount of data on that screen so that you can minimize the number of clicks? I think it's more about that. It's not just clicks, it's how that data is organized. And that's something that I've noticed, and it's one of the first things that shoots out, that's rather stands out to me as I look at gradebooks is, can I see several of my assignments and all of my students simultaneously? And often that's not the case. And so that's something that comes to mind.
Yeah, that's interesting because there is this notion of like of how information gets served up to you. And Ryan, thanks for contributing in the chat, because you mentioned things important to you include reports, integration with other apps, and the UX piece. And I think that's what Justin is speaking to, is that UX where it's not only about just does it look gorgeous, but does it actually function? Does it give me the experience that I really need to move through my day? And here's the thing: when you walk into a classroom, I've noticed that when myself or others, our heads look around, we don't go right to the grade book. We don't go right to that little ledger of numbers and letters. We go to see what's happening in the classroom, what's working. We like to see work on the desks. We like to see something funky on that weird table that you can't get rid of in the back of your classroom, Justin. And I think that that user experience should be somewhat accommodating to the fluid nature of classrooms. So I appreciate you sharing that out. I think that's really important. And I think maybe that's part of what we're after, which is, does this serve our needs? And I spoke to Justin before this, so I want to pivot just a little bit, because in the search for the ultimate grade book, again, whether it's ours or another one, we've been talking about, certain functionality like standards-based grading or seating assignments, attendance, things like that. And one thing I learned from Justin, speaking to him a few weeks ago, was that by definition, grading is communicating. And I don't think it landed on me in that precise a way until I spoke to Justin. Just the act of designating a grade, you're communicating whether or not that student has demonstrated mastery or the extent to which. But beyond that, with the new functionality, you're also communicating out to parents as well and engaging them. Justin, talk about that kind of mind shift around, it's not just about the grade, it's about the communication impact. It's pretty important, especially this year.
Yeah, I'd agree. I didn't realize that at first. I just wanted a way to have my grades online so that students could access from home. And yes, that in and of itself is a form of communication, but it didn't really dawn on me how much that changes. I mean, at my site, we're to the point now where the teachers really don't see much of a need for parent conferences. Now, we still have them, of course, but they don't serve the same function. This isn't even 15 years ago, right? 15 years ago or so, no one was, if teachers were using an electronic gradebook, it was very fundamental. It had no online component to it. So students didn't always know what their grade was. Parents especially didn't know. And so parent conferences, as an example, that time was to notify the parents. It was to bring them up to speed. Once your gradebooks go online and parents and students have 24-hour access, you don't need to do that. Now, if there's something specific that you want to discuss that you prefer not to do, via short message or email or telephone, you rather do in person, then of course it makes sense. But the nature of what parent conferences is, I think, is shifting. And I think it's kind of shifted right underneath our feet. We did, because of the pandemic, we did all of our parent conferences, on Zoom. We set it up and we communicated with the parents. We sent out notifications, had them make, appointments for us and give them time slots. And it was pretty fast. And parents that are able to use the technology and have access to everything were able to get the answers and the information that they needed. And Jupiter started with the messaging feature. I don't even know how many years ago. I'm sure Amy can hop in and clarify that. But at first, I didn't see all the value, because at that time we still had a lot of students that really weren't accessing. With this shift, a few years ago, my school, about 5 years ago, my school actually, we went 1-to-1 with Chromebooks. So every student all of a sudden had access to the gradebook, and that shifted things further. But Jupiter had it years before. So they had been, when she says it seems like to her they've been working for the last 10 years to, preparing for the pandemic, they had almost everything in place. And it's not to say, hey, look at them. It's just, it's a good situation. It worked out very well. They happened to be trying to be in front of the curve, adding features, and it just so happened that it was able to, for our site, work out really well. I mean, I had teachers tell me, Justin, we would not have been able to get through this year if it weren't for Jupiter. And I can't argue. I don't know how we would have done it. Now, we're not just using Jupiter, obviously. Someone in the chat had mentioned the idea of how well it integrates with other things. Most of us teachers are using at least 3 or 4 things as part of our teaching technology repertoire. But as a gradebook, Jupiter kind of held it all together for us.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that sentiment. Kind of holding it together has been the theme for the year. Like, we're all just holding it together. But I think what's been really interesting about school districts as they reevaluate the nature of gradebooks and their role in communications, it's starting to raise the expectation. Amy, I'll turn to you, because I think you've seen this in the work that you've done with schools, where, especially around the parent communication piece, they're looking for more than just end of semester grades. And you've got to give your teachers a way to deliver context and nuance, not just to summative grades, but every step along the way. Can you talk about what the sort of higher expectation is now for all this communication piece?
Yeah, sure. One of the things that we've been seeing is, like Justin was saying, I've been with the company now, coming up 11 years now. And in the beginning, I found that, high schoolers would log on. But then for, K through 8, it was mostly just the parents logging on. And then as the years ticked by, it just got younger and younger and younger and younger and younger, until now with the pandemic, it feels like, every kid of every age is logging into Jupiter and really engaging with it. With the messaging part of it, again, from us trying to make this as easy as possible for the teacher, we're always looking at, can we automate some of those messages? Can the teacher, when I was a classroom teacher and I would have to notify parents about missing assignments, I would have to go through all of my grade books, figure out who has what missing assignment, figure out who their parents were, find their parents' email address, and draft an individual email to each one of those kids' parents. And with Jupiter, you can literally just click on, missing assignments, message to parents, and then it sends that email to those parents with a list of their kids' missing assignments. And you can even go to a further gradation and say, only send this to the parents who have a kid who has a C or less in my class. So for us, trying to, again, cut down on the amount of work that the teacher has to do and make it easy for the school to communicate with them. I'll never forget, I don't know, I think it was 2013 maybe, and I was talking to the New York City Department of Education, and we were talking about our messaging, and they were happy with it. But, you know, they said, a lot of our parents don't have access to email at home. And it just clicked with me. I was like, well, why are we not texting them? Because even back then, you know, in 2013, there were a lot of people who still didn't have smartphones. So they weren't accessing that stuff. So at that time, we added texting to the parents at that, that feature at that time. And since then, it has just, you know, continued to grow every year. Makes it really easy for the teachers and the administrators to be able to communicate with the parents and students by messaging and texting.
All right, so there's a couple of things happening there. One is on the parent side, they can get they can get information 24/7, so they can log in and see what's happening. Now, I'm a parent. I have 3 kids, elementary and 2 middle. I'm a little bit limited. I won't name the system, but I do confess to being a little bit limited at my school district here in Pennsylvania. It's a small district. We can log in and see just one number related to their different classes. And it's a little bit frustrating because I want to unpack what's underneath that number, like what's driving to that number, and I can't. So it requires an additional lift for me. But that's okay. I have a good relationship with my kids, and they're all good students. So I'm blessed. I'm lucky that way. So, but it would be nice to be able to see that. But on the flip side, the other piece of this communication is the teacher aspect. And I don't think I realized that systems are now at a place where they can segment so specifically. So if you can find only students with, you know, under a certain grade point average and who are currently missing assignments, send it out to all those kids. Hopefully it's, you know, few, but there might be more than one. And that you can segment is a big deal. And I think this gets back to Justin, which is like, how do I just save time and how do I make it work for me?
Well, and one of the things, you know,
yeah,
for
go ahead,
us,
Amy.
one of the things for us when, you know, Justin was talking about us having the messaging for a long time, we're also trying to keep our ear to the ground, or what are the types of questions that parents are asking through our messaging system? Because we keep seeing, like, I don't know, it was a few years ago where parents kept asking about homework. And we were like, we have all these parents who are bugging their teacher about what's my kid's homework, where the kid's homework is there on that same portal where they just sent them a message. That must mean that seeing their homework easily is not, it's not placed well enough. So we're trying to pay attention to what the questions are, what time is being taken up from those teachers, and try to streamline it as much as possible. So we move the homework to a different place. So when a parent goes on there, it's easier for them to see that homework right there, and then they don't even have to click to ask the teacher a question. Right. So for us with the messaging, it's not just about making it as easy as possible for people to message to teachers, but also trying to get a lesson from what people are asking about.
Right. And that echoes a point earlier in this conversation about, you know, how do I organize things in such a way that they serve my needs? And I think Justin has been helpful in illuminating what some of those needs are. Now, a quick room reset. We're talking about how to evaluate a gradebook for the small school districts of our world. You know, your association is really important, an advocate for those small school districts who, you know, deal with a lot of complexity, but do so with minimal resources. So when we're looking at the nature of gradebooks, and for this particular webinar, we've talked about some of the features that make the most sense, and what that does in terms of a benefit or an impact on teaching and learning. And then, of course, here we are talking about communicating. But Justin, there's another secret to success, which is the people behind a platform. And, you know, when you've evaluated systems, just think generally now. Again, we're talking about gradebooks, but it might be an LMS, for example, or an SIS, or something broader. But when you're thinking about a platform, how do you start to size up, you know, the people behind it, the support, the things that go into making it work? Like, we have some questions here, but what questions come to mind for you as you start to evaluate?
You know, if you're if you're asking me, technical support is important. I'll be honest, I don't usually think about that first. I figure out, do I think that this looks good? Does it look like it's going to work for me? Then if I find that it's working, at some point I'm going to inevitably, need to talk to someone, contact, the people behind the platform, as it were. And fortunately, I've had very positive experiences working with Jupiter, as Amy had mentioned when she came on. We've emailed back and forth for a number of years. I don't know how many at this point, on a number of issues. Whether it's probably sometime billing, probably some I tend to be kind of a big mouth. I've made lots of suggestions over the years about things. I'm like, I don't know if this works right, or this would be great. And what's been nice is, first of all, they usually respond 7 days a week, even if it's like a Sunday morning at 9 a.m. Someone usually responds before Monday, and I like that. I mean, more than 9 out of 10 times when I mention a particular issue or something, they usually know what it is, how to fix it. If there are some anomalies, and that happens on occasion, they've always worked hard to get things resolved very quickly. So I've always appreciated that. It's when you're dealing with something that's transitioning or expanding, I should say, from a gradebook to a more of a learning management platform, the kinds of issues you have all of a sudden multiply. It's no longer just inputting grades. It's, wait, hang on, I did this assignment and I set this setting and it didn't work right. So then you have a whole nother can of worms that you may have opened up when you expand a platform like that. But I will say that again, per our experiences, it's worked out pretty well. I've had minimal, and I give the majority of my assignments in my classes as part of what Jupyter offers, built in.
Yeah, you're a power user. So if anyone's going to break the platform, it's someone like you.
Yeah.
So far you haven't, but keep trying for sure. It's interesting you mentioned, and I don't want to put Amy on the spot here, but the one thing I've noticed is, one of the myths around education in general is that it's a Monday to Friday gig, 9 months a year. And I always bristle at that because, as anyone on this call can attest, being an educator is 7 days a week, 365 days a year. And whether you're, actively in the teaching and learning mode during the regular school year, you're working nights and weekends. So Amy, your team though seems like it's constantly responding, even on Saturdays and Sundays. Is that true?
Well, technically, we're not open on Saturday and Sunday, but some of our staff are catching up on work and will answer people on the weekends. But we do open at 7:30 a.m. Eastern, and we're open until about 5:30 p.m. Pacific. So that's a nice long 13 hours that we're available every day. And we try to get back to everybody within an hour. Most of the time we're successful. Sometimes it can take up to 3 hours. Or there might be an issue that we're having to, put a lot more research into. But I would say the majority of support questions that we get are answered within 1 to 3 hours. We have support people in each time zone.
Right. And for those listening in on this call or viewing our session in the future, feels like a really good question to ask your potential provider, whether it's Gradebook, LMS, some broader enterprise level system, which is talk to us about your responsiveness. Now, Amy, you've been able to serve it up pretty clearly. We usually get back to you within an hour or less, as fast as a pizza in my neighborhood.
Well, one of the things that comes up a lot too is that, because we're former teachers, it never occurred to us to not let teachers contact support. And one of the things that I've had from people in the past is that, support can only be contacted by an administrator and the teachers have to go through the administrator to get to support. But for us, anyone who's a teacher or administrative user on Jupyter is welcome to call or email. And, we try to get back to them as quickly as possible.
Yeah, that's empowering. Justin, have you, being the administrator on site for this platform, have you had to field a lot of teacher inquiries, or like what's, are you partitioning them off and saying, no, I'll deal with it? Or how does that
No,
work?
my staff is pretty capable. I know not all staffs are like that, but mine is. So there are many features that I have staff members that start using them before I do. They're available. They get in there. They mess around with things. And I mean, if something goes wrong, they'll ask me, "Hey, what's going on with this?" And then I'll have to learn it real quick because I can usually learn things quickly. And then and if I see something odd, I'll shoot a message out to support. Otherwise, I get in there and I help them out. So again, my staff's pretty good. I do field a good amount of questions, but we've been on it for a long time now. So the most of the questions we get are very specific type questions. For example, I had a question the other day where the teacher had their gradebook weighted according to our student handbook, but there was a category that he did that wasn't represented and in his grades, and so he was like, and he was asking about, okay, so how does this work if this category isn't percentage, if this category isn't represented, how does that weigh out? And so I explained how Jupyter deals with that, and he's like, okay, so if I put in this many points here, what does it do? I was like, well, see, now that's going to be that entire category. So you have to be careful if you don't have enough assignments for a category, and on down the line. And so they're very specific questions are the questions I get at this point. When we get a new teacher, most of the new teachers we get are on the younger side. They're a little more familiar with working, with a end user
Platform.
technology, and they figure out things quickly.
Yeah, that's true. They're less afraid than an old guy like me to just point and click and say, what does this do? So I support that. Some of the,
Well,
yeah, go ahead, Amy.
one of the things I was going to say about what Justin is talking about too is that, over the years since, Justin's been using their product for quite a long time as well. And, when new features come up, because they're all created by the same development team that we've had since the very beginning, they all sort of talk the same way, right? Just like when you see a new Google product, because you've used Google Maps and Google Forms and Google Meetings, you know how to use those products because they sort of speak the same language. And that's one of the things I think that has been a strength for Jupyter, is that we're not buying up features from other products and sort of stitching them all together. It's the same development team the entire time. So when Justin sees a new feature, since he already knows how to use Jupyter, like learning that new feature is probably not a big deal because it sort of, is intuitive in the same way.
Right. Yeah, that intuitive piece is really important, as is that common language that starts to come together around systems like this and processes, which I think is pretty important. We're in the home stretch for this webinar, so I want to talk a little bit about the big picture, which was, how do we know? how do you know it's the right one? How have we found Mr. or Miss Right when it comes to grading and even a learning platform? And Justin, these are the things that we served up, especially in the context of the here and now, which is the ability to adapt between a remote and a hybrid setting. And serving that hybrid learning piece, I think, is really interesting because that's not going away. And even in like my home district, where we have teachers teaching to kids in the classroom and those on the computer, can you imagine? They're just toggling between both real time. How do you know it's the right one? I think it comes down to how do the stakeholders benefit, but like what comes to, like big picture, how do you know you found the right one?
I mean, you don't know, right? I mean, that's the uncomfortable truth. You don't know because there are. I mean, I'm sure there's a finite number, but there are a number of options. You know that you've chosen one that'll work for you if it has the features that you need, if it serves the necessary people you need it to serve, if it handles and benefits the stakeholders, basically, like you put it there. It just, that's how you know. And I think you're right. For this past school year, whatever you chose needed to have some sort of online component to make things work together well. Now, what that looks like moving forward, I mean, we really don't know, right? But my money would be on you're still going to need online components. And I think at this point, people are more accustomed to it. And I'm one of those teachers that always tries to reduce paper, even as a math teacher. I do require my students to maintain some sort of a math notebook where they keep their notes. but I don't really want their assignments in paper form anymore. And that's something I had shifted to before Jupiter. Sorry, not before Jupiter, before the pandemic. I kind of shifted to that. So I would say that, the first thing you're looking for is, does it suit your needs? Because District A's needs are not going to be the same as District B's needs. They're just not going to be the same. That's just the fact of the matter. But I will say that if you can get a diverse group of teachers, which like we have on my site, to agree that this platform is going to work for them and they get used to it and they're comfortable with it, I'd say for all intents and purposes, you've chosen the right one. That's the closest you're going to get, though.
That's true. Yeah, you're right. I often see, because I work with a range of organizations in education, that the old adage play out, which is, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And I feel like sometimes the platforms out there, whether it's in grading or learning platforms or information, this is what we have, and we're just going to pound you with it, and you'll have to adapt. And I feel like it's unfair to schools, particularly to small school districts, who just have so much complexity and nuance. So thanks for that insight. And helping find the right one, it has to be the right one for us, for what we need in particular. I want to take just a few minutes to figure out what is Jupiter anyway. We've been citing them as a model. We're very pleased to underwrite this level of engagement for the SSDA. It's a great organization, and we're very happy to be a part of the community, including a conference this spring and ongoing events. It's really our privilege. And we'd like to take just a moment or two, Amy, for you to introduce us a little bit more to what Jupiter is and what it's capable of.
Absolutely. So as we've been talking about this whole time, I really like what Justin said is about the gradebook, because, I've seen the same thing in this industry, being in this industry now for almost 15 years. I was with another company before Jupiter. But with a gradebook, part of it is often an add-on to other products. So people will be like, well, we have this great, parent communication thing, and we have a gradebook, as if a gradebook is some thing that you can slap on the side. Where for us, the gradebook is really at the core of our being when it comes to this product, because as classroom teachers, this is what mattered most to us. This is what we use the most. So with our learning management system and student information system, the gradebook is where all of the information is originating from, the students and whatnot. The learning management system grew over time. We were always trying to listen to our customers about what are the things that they need next. Justin's right. We get a lot of requests from, other people like Justin saying, hey, this one thing doesn't work right, or man, I really wish this did this. That's how we got started adding feature after feature after feature. Why can't it do attendance? Why can't it do classroom discipline? So it just continued on and on and on from there. So with our learning management system, with the online assignments, online grading, being able to mark up essays online, mark up worksheets online, along with standards-based grading, and being able to take those standards-based gradings down to the question level within an assessment. And then, of course, the student information system sort of developed right along with that, because you're getting all this information about the kids and their grades. And of course, you're having to keep track of everything about the parents, keep track of everything about, their medical information and everything that pertains to, the student's record. Most recently, we added the enrollment and applications, tuition and payments, and that got started in 2017. And that has really taken off for us, I would say, over these past 2 years, since things were getting started with COVID, where schools really want to have a way for students to register online and have a way for them to fill out forms online. So the enrollment and applications feature does include custom forms online, including we created, upon request of a lot of our schools during COVID, daily forms that would just be regenerated on a daily basis, since parents had to fill out, symptom forms around COVID attendance. And then, of course, the tuition and payments is our schools, the private schools that are collecting tuition, or the public schools who are just giving parents a way to pay online for fines or for PE uniform or buying a t-shirt or making donations.
Yeah, it's amazing how when you think about the gradebook, that which is the the thing we're shining a spotlight on today is the gradebook, but it really does have to sit inside a broader ecosystem. And what I like to think is that the gradebook is the engine that makes all of these things highly relevant. So for sure, you need data and you need a learning apparatus around it. Of course, you can't function if you're not able to enroll and manage your kiddos. But coming back down to it, that gradebook is a bit of the engine. Let's take a brief preview because if I understand correctly, inside of Jupyter, you have an awful lot that you can do. And I think for folks who listening in now or down the road, I'm sure Jupyter would be very happy to do a deep dive on this. But we're going to show just very, very quickly a few things. The gradebook, how you do grading options, and then a brief preview of the markup. So here's a summary view of the gradebook. Amy, hit us with just a couple of highlights.
Yeah, so this would be a standards-based grading gradebook. You'll see the standards there on the bottom left, where the teacher has selected the standard, the learning objectives that they're assessing with this assignment. And notice that the teacher has selected to grade each one of those learning objectives separately. And it allows them, they have the choice of together or separately. And then notice that they're able to weight each one of those learning objectives for this assignment, and then they can make a comment about how the student is doing on that assignment, as well as leaving an emoji that would show up on their grading screen in the student portal.
The emojis thing always cracks me up because my research going back before even working with Jupyter was, do teachers really want emojis? And every teacher said yes, whatever it takes for a kid to have engagement or for a parent to understand what we're talking about, give me the emojis for sure. Absolutely. So there's a lot happening on this screen, but that's interesting because it is all on one screen. And yet I don't feel overwhelmed, which I think is pretty important. Let's talk about the specific grading functionality, because you really can go deep and get really nuanced on the grading piece.
Yeah, when I'm doing demos for teachers, this is one of the screens I really like about how they can set up the grading in their gradebook and what, how they can really customize it to themselves. So if you're doing standards-based grading, if you're not doing standards-based grading, if you're doing standards-based grading, you want it to be summative grading, what grade scale you want to use. We have, 20-ish grade scales in Jupyter, but then you can create your own. So, there's no limit to whatever type of grade scale that you want to use. And then, of course, you can copy this grade scale to all the other classes or just have a specific grade scale for that class. The thing I really think about as a teacher is the field that talks about special marks, so that I can be putting those special marks into that assignment where then it marks it as missing or it marks it as something that needs to be turned in again or incomplete. And then, of course, those categories that Justin was talking about earlier, that if you have specific categories and you do want them to be weighted, then you can go ahead and put those in as well. This whole screen that you see here can be set by the administrator. It's defaulted to let each teacher make their decision about their gradebook individually. But if you have a school that has really, staunch rules around the grade scale and whatnot, then it can be set by the administrator, and so that all teachers see the same thing.
And it's this kind of data that you can then parse out who you want to communicate with. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yep, that's amazing to me. I love it. I think it's pretty amazing. What's also kind of amazing is the markup screen. So you have this kind of, I've seen this before, this split view of the student work. Talk about how this gets served up and how you kind of pull it all together.
Yeah, so there's a couple different ways to think about it. Like, for instance, if a student wrote an essay, then they can just cut and paste the essay into the specific window in Jupyter so that the teacher can be marking it up. But what we saw even more, I mean, that's what we had, you know, long before COVID, and lots of people are using that at upper grade levels. But what we saw with COVID is, you know, third graders who are home and they're used to writing directly on a worksheet, and now suddenly how are they going to be able to do that online? So what we did is juiced up this feature a little bit so that the student can literally just use their phone, take a picture of the worksheet. It loads the worksheet up here for the teacher. Then they can write on it with the marker, or you know, type directly onto it and then put stickers onto it. And then the student is able to see that at home. And then of course the teacher can give the student a grade. If there's a rubric for the grading of this assignment, they can fill that in. They can choose to grade it anonymously so that they're not seeing which student turned it in if they want to. And then you can see whether or not it's been turned in previously. Is this a second draft of something? Was it turned in late, etc. So trying to make it as easy for the teacher as possible. And like Justin was saying, how do I avoid having stacks of paper? I remember being a young teacher and walking out with big, huge stacks of paper that I was going to sit on my couch that night and check, you know, through all of those spelling tests. And, you know, it's just a relief not to have those big stacks of paper that I'm carrying back and forth from work anymore.
Yeah, and so once you're done grading this, another one can get served up automatically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Wow. And you can do it anonymously, which has the potential to remove unconscious bias from the grading function, which I think is pretty powerful. I mean, again, it seems to speak to like David and the development team, many of whom have an education background, being a little bit selfish about this. What would I want if I was in the classroom? Because that's really important. We're winding down the hour, so we'd invite you to ask any questions either in the using your mic and video or in the chat. You're welcome to ask questions now or later. Here's our contact information. You can reach Justin via this email. He's a really good guy. I've spoken to him a couple of times, so I don't mind saying he'd be delighted to hear from you. I hope you don't mind me saying that, Justin. Of course, you can reach Amy at amy.carmichael@jupitered.com. I don't think you're going to need me, but you're always welcome to give me a ring. This is the kind of work I do for a living, which is helping schools find their way to making the best decisions that work for them. In this case, it's been talking about, you know, what is the ultimate gradebook and how does it serve teachers, students, the parents and adults who care about them. It's been a privilege to speak with you, Justin, and Amy, and to be a part of this overall association. We're really glad to be a part of it. Thanks everyone at the SSDA and all our members. You are small and mighty, and we're grateful to you. Amy, thanks so much for being here. Justin, thanks so much.
Thanks, Justin. Nice to see you in person.
Hey, no problem. Same.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all so much. We really appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thank you. It was a lot of fun. Appreciate you sticking around, Corey, and pulling it together. If you